I want to welcome you to our 2023 Dairy Goat webinar series hosted by the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. My name is Jennifer Bentley, and I work as a dairy field specialist here housed in Northeast Iowa. I will have a few of my colleagues on here today as well as we facilitate some of the discussion at the end of the webinar. We do this webinar mostly monthly here, and so we're kind of wrapping up our season as we talk here today in November, but just want to remind you of our upcoming webinars. We have one more in the 2023 season. So December 21st, we're going to focus on milk quality investigations, and that's going to be presented by Dr. Fauna Smith with UC Davis College of Veterinary Medicine. And then I also want to just remind you to stay tuned for our schedule that will be coming out probably end of December, looking at the 2024 Dairy Goat webinar series. We've had good response to it, so we want to keep moving forward with some education in the dairy goats. So just a few housekeeping things before we start the webinar here today. Please just mute your microphones and turn off any cameras during our presentations. If you have questions during the presentation, don't hesitate to put those in the chat box and we'll facilitate those questions at the end. And then this webinar is being recorded, so it will be hosted on our Dairy Extension website as well as our YouTube channel. I'll do a follow-up email with those links for you, as well as the resources that are going to come with this program here today as well. I'll attach those to that email. So again, after the presentation, I will also put an evaluation link into the chat box. If you just want to click on that before you exit the webinar, that just really helps us with our programming and our educational topics as we look into the 2024 year, what you're wanting to hear more about. So if you could please fill that out before you log off here today. So our topic here today is dairy goat cost of production. We're happy to have Marlene Paibomesai here. Marlene completed her PhD at the University of Guelph in dairy cattle immunity and genetics, and she joined Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs livestock team as a dairy specialist in 2014. So welcome to our webinar series, Marlene, and I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen here and get you set up.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation to come and present today. And I was saying before, I've presented quite a bit here in Ontario on this particular topic, but looking forward to having the opportunity to be able to present this across to our neighbors in the south here. So I'm located here in Guelph, Ontario, which is kind of smack dab in the middle of like southwestern, southern Ontario. And it's really that like agricultural hub where I am. So a majority of the goat farms that we worked with on this project are in that area. So I work as a dairy specialist. It's our extension team, our livestock team that oversee kind of different commodities in Ontario, part of the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. And here's my contact information. So if you have any questions about what you've seen here today, or if there's anything else that you see on our blog that strikes you as interesting, then please send me an email or give me a call. And you can also follow me on social media, so Twitter and Instagram at Dairytastic. So part of my job, I do cover dairy goat production systems, but I also cover dairy cattle production systems and also sheep production systems as well. And so what we're going to do, a part of today's presentation, is we're going to start with talking about Canada's goat industry. I think it's important to talk about Canada's goat industry in order for you to kind of center where our cost of production project is really stemming from, and also in the terms of the context of how our production systems look here in Canada. And so after we go through a bit of a Canada goat industry stats, we're then going to go into the overall cost of production project. So let's get into it. So we have a number of different goat milk products that are produced here in Canada and Ontario. These could be soft cheeses, hard cheeses. We have some fluid milk, yogurts, ice creams, infant formula, powdered milk, as well as fermented products as well, and some soap and beauty products. I would say, though, majority of the goat milk products are being transformed into soft cheeses. So a good portion of our industry is a cheese industry, and that's what we see represented here in Ontario. So in terms
Marlene,
of, yeah.
did we want to launch those poll questions before we get too
Oh,
far into
yes.
it?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Let's launch our poll questions. I think I
Yeah.
just answered one.
Well, maybe they didn't see the slide yet, so
Yeah, okay.
we'll do that. So we just had a few poll questions before we talk about what dairy
I
goat
think it's a
production
little
looks
bit
like in
further.
Canada.
Yeah.
So the first question, if you can see that there, how many goats are in Canada? So if people want to, hopefully didn't see the slide. So is it 50,000, 250,000, 500,000, or a million? I have my guesses, but I waiting to see what the audience thinks here. And we had about 32 people on the webinar here today, so we're just about close to everybody filling it out. So I'll go ahead and end that, and I'll share those results. Are you able to see the results there, Marlene?
Yeah, so it looks like we have a combination between 41% was 250,000 and 41% was 500,000. And if you thought a million. So the answer is in the next slide. So
Okay.
we'll let that go.
And then I'll do the other poll as well.
Yeah, the next poll as well.
Yep. And so our other question that we wanted you to answer is, how often do you calculate your farm's cost of production? So knowing that that's our focus here today, talking about dairy goat cost of production, we just want to get an idea of if you're a dairy goat producer yourself, or maybe you work with somebody on a dairy goat operation, how often are you kind of evaluating that? So we'll give you a chance here to fill that out. Looks like the majority have filled it out, so I'll go ahead and share that out as well. So it looks like the majority are once a year evaluating that, about 70%, and then about close to 20% only when they're making a big change. So
yeah. Perfect. Yeah. And so the answer for our first poll question is in the next slide here. So we, as a part of the agricultural census, we collect data in terms of the number of farms and the populations of different livestock species. So this is where this data is coming from. So as a part of our 2021 census, our overall goat farm number was just shy of 5,000. So these are farms with goats, I should say. And the population was just over 250,000. So we have around 250,000 goats that are here in Canada. What we've seen, and this trend is pretty much across the board of what we're seeing in terms of farm numbers. But since the census years in 1991 to today, we're seeing a decrease in the number of farms that have goats. But we are seeing an increase in terms of the goat population. So this gives us an indication that we're most likely seeing an increase in herd sizes here in Canada for our goat farms. So goat farms, as said, around 4,800 farms with goats across Canada. So this would represent our meat goats, dairy goats, fiber goats, and just over that 250,000 mark for a number of goats. And if we look at it as a percentage, Ontario, which is located here, I'm speaking from here today. So we have, all of this of Ontario to the north of where I am today. But the population of goats here are about 57% of the goat population. So Ontario is really the driver of the goat industries here in Canada. Quebec, which is our neighbors to the east, has about 16% of our goat population. Alberta, around 13% or so, and then less than 10% in BC and Saskatchewan, and some goats in Manitoba and Nova Scotia as well. And these other areas don't have a very significant goat population. There are some goats there, but they're just not at the same scale of what we see in different parts of Canada. So Ontario is where we've really focused this cost of production project, and because we do have a large number of goat farms in this area. So to give you context in terms of where the industry is at when we had put forward this cost of production project. So we do register dairy goat operations with the provincial government, so with Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, in order for them to ship grade A milk. So we have a really good idea in terms of the number of farms that we have here in Ontario that are shipping grade A goat milk. So from 2010 up to 2022, you kind of see this ebb and flow of the number of dairy goat farms that we have here in the province. So at our peak in 2017, we had around 290, and as of last year, there was 207. So we did have a number of goat farms leave. This decrease represents about 25%. So we have had a large number of goat farms leave. And part of that was due to the costs of production, as well as that milk price at that time in 2017. It really put a lot of pressure on these farms, and with the cost kind of continuing to increase every year, especially in terms of building costs, for instance. And we see that reflected in our overall numbers as well. So in the 2021 census, we had 289 dairy goat farms across Canada, and that was a decrease from the 357 from 2016. Quebec also had seen some similar declines as well, so it seems to be across the board for our dairy goat industries. In terms of liters, so this is another thing that we're looking at whenever we had put forward the cost of production in the industry. We're talking about doing a cost of production. So the number of liters of goat milk production in Canada is today around 63 million liters. And so that production has been relatively stable since 2017. But if we take a look further back in time, from 2008 through to 2017, there was year-over-year increases of goat milk in production in Ontario specifically, but in Canada in general. And so Ontario is really leading the way in terms of goat milk production and increasing goat milk production, and represents about 90% of the goat milk production here in Canada. And overall, our quality. So I know you talked about milk quality, and sounds like you'll be talking about milk quality again in December. But this just gives you a standpoint of where our bulk tanks sit currently. So an average of around 100 or less than 100,000 back to scan. Our somatic cell count is over 1 million. And our fat and protein percentage on all of the bulk tanks across 2019 and 2022 sit around 3.8 to 3.83, and protein percent around 3.4 and as low as 3.36. And so this really allows us to kind of see where our current industry is at in terms of production of components as well as the quality of the milk. So the size of our operations here in Canada are really quite varied. So we have some smaller dairy goat operations, and we have some larger dairy goat operations. So this graph here is showing you the proportion of farms and the gross farm receipts. So the percentage of farms is in this blue color. The lighter blue is the percentage of gross farm receipts. But if we just focus on the percentage of farms for this one, we have up to 1 million here in terms of gross farm receipts. And we have a few farms that are in that category. but a majority of the industry is between this 100,000 and 500,000 range. And so that represents what would be our average goat farm, dairy goat farm here in Ontario. We do have some smaller production systems here as well. We also have, put it in more context in terms of our current productivity. We've done some various surveys in order to understand kind of where we sit with goat productivity within the province. So in 2018, 2020, we sent out a survey to be able to see, what the average milk production per goat and the average price of goat milk that's being received. I'll just move to the next slide here. And so the production of goat milk, or the production of goat milk on a liter per goat per year basis in 2020 was around 1,000 liters. And so, it's 1,000 liters per goat per year. But one of the things to take away, each one of these bars here is a farm. And we have the liters and by goat by year on the side. You can see that there are some farms that are below 1,000, and we have some farms that are above 1,000. So the max here was just shy of 1,400 liters per goat per year, and the low here is 654. And so there's a lot of opportunity in here to really understand some of those things that are driving productivity within the industry. The liters are just one part of it, because our pricing is based on protein and fat. And so that brings us to our next graph here, which is the price in Canadian of price per liter. And so our average price is around, at that time in 2020, was around $1.03 per liter. But the variation across these farms, again, each one of these are farms at the bottom here, the variation of pricing between these farms was quite high. So as low as 83 cents and as high as $1.13 per liter pricing. And that really has to do with whether producers are maximizing their components. Majority of our revenue share is from protein, and also whether they're taking a part of winter incentive programs that the purchase of milk offer at times. And so this puts us in context of where the goat industry is at, and you're probably thinking in terms of how it might compare to the goat industry in your state, as I recognize that we have different people from different states here. And so overall, dairy goat milk production is stable across Canada. We're at 63 million liters. Most of that is coming from Ontario. And we have seen a decline in the number of goat farms, but it's suggesting that we're seeing an increase in terms of the number of herds and the herd sizes that we have here in Ontario. So this brings us to the goat cost of production. One of the first things is we want to consider, why do we care? Why do we care about talking about cost of production? There's a few different reasons. So one of them, and probably the one that comes to mind the most, is assessing the financial health of your business. So, it could be allowing you to be able to identify problems within the financial part of your business. So, is there money going into different areas where maybe you could have some opportunities to, brings us to the second point, which is identifying efficiencies. So making sure that you're able to get the most out of what you're putting in. So identifying those efficiencies in terms of feed efficiency, for instance, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And it also allows you to have informed purchasing. So from our poll, we had some people that do cost of production at times of when they're making big changes. So, that could be either bringing in new infrastructure, building new buildings, perhaps you're expanding your business. And so this might be able to help you to help inform those purchases that you're making on that side. And also helps with that future business planning as well too, understanding that cost of production and whether you're able to whether your business is going to be able to be able to withstand that purchase and be able to pay that back. And the last part here is setting price. And I think this is important, you know, like we did this project kind of more of like an industry standpoint, but it can be important for individual sellers of products as well. So whether you have your own plant where you're making your own cheese, or perhaps making chocolate milk, like was suggested earlier in the webinar, this really helps you with understanding that cost of production of the input of that goat milk that's going into the plant, and making sure that you are able to set that price at a point where it does make financial sense to be able to continue into that operation. I know people do farming for different reasons, but financial health and financial stresses can create a lot of stress on people and businesses. And so being able to really understand that cost of production can help you with identifying areas where you might be able to improve. So overall, the project was ran by MNP. This is courtesy of one of their slides. So MNP is an accounting firm that's here in Canada, and they've ran multiple cost of production studies in various commodity groups. So the Goat Value Chain Roundtable is just an industry group that comes together from across the value chain to talk about various things. And one of the challenges that was identified at the beginning of this roundtable was a need to understand how we can increase productivity and competitiveness of the Ontario dairy goat producers. So at that time, we kind of had heard that it was hard to make a living as a dairy goat producer, that many dairy goat producers had off-farm jobs to be able to make their operations work. And so there was really a need for being able to run kind of a more current cost of production, because costs had really changed since the previous one had been done, to understand some of those risks that people are taking on within this industry, and if there's way that we can kind of improve the productivity and competitiveness in there. So overall, the data collection was 3 years, from 2019 to 2021, and this collected financial and production information on the various herds. The producers that had supported this project had received their own individual reports, but we were also able to create an aggregate summary as well. And one of the other kind of key parts of this project was being able to look at how we can produce a benchmarking tool that would be available for people to be able to put their own numbers in and look at the benchmark data from these particular years. You know, I have presented this in Ontario a few times in the spring, and it felt like, you know, we were already out of date. So, but I think this allows us to give us a good benchmark years where we can see what was going on in the goat industry at that time, and hope we'll be able to repeat it in the future where we can see how that has changed. So the dairy goat for operations that took part in here, I would say had a good variation in terms of representing the different operations that we have here in Ontario. So we had 16 farms that participated for all of the 3 years. And I would say with that, because there's so much variation in our cost of production, that this is where I'll put the disclaimer in, that we do need to understand that this is just a small portion of the overall goat industry. So it's a great representation of some of the farms that we do see in Ontario, but it is a very limited number of farms. And so with some of the variability that I'll talk about later, you can kind of see where it might be a little bit of a challenge to be able to say that this represents all dairy goat operations, but it does give us an opportunity to start somewhere. The average herd size of these farms was around 445 does. So this is an average size of farm for Ontario. And the range of the number of milking does was from 109 up to 897. So had a big range in terms of our the herd sizes that we were looking for, which was one of the things that we were hoping to get out of our sample size. So the number of liters that were produced in a year averaged around 423,000 liters. And so I think that's, if I did my conversion correct in pounds, that would be around 900,000 pounds-ish. And one of the things that we look at from the Canadian dairy that we really wanted to do was be able to standardize the fat and protein for the milk. So we agreed that to standardize, we would look at a 3.8% butter fat and a 3.4 protein. And so when we talk about the liter costs as we go forward in the presentation, that's what I'm referring to. So it's a standardized liter at 3.8 fat and 3.4% protein. And our last part here is the productivity of the does. So with that standardized liter in mind, the does on average were producing 973 liters per doe per year. So I would say, based on some of our previous data, which I presented at the beginning of this presentation, this represents our kind of average farm that we have here in Ontario.
I'm
Okay. Oh, I think somebody's on mute. And so with the cost of production study, we wanted to look at it in 3 different ways. There's different ways that you can look at, for instance, feed production with cost of production. So we wanted to make sure that we had that laid out and understood in terms of what that meant for how those allocations went. So we have kind of 3 levels of cost of production. So the first one is our cash cost. So this is going to help us indicate cash flow and the overall cash that's available in the cash that's part of the cost of production, sorry, within the operation. The key part here is that we included the cost of feed production into the cash cost, as opposed to doing a feed market value. So sometimes you'll see in cost productions, they'll do a feed market value, kind of fair market value for that feed, and evaluate that way. We, on the other hand, had done it as a cost of that feed production into there. And so that would be taking, for instance, if you have other livestock, you would take a certain allocation of your feed production costs. So cost of fertilizer, fuel, seed, all of those things, and it would go to the dairy goat enterprise as a cash cost. We also had our financial and medium term. So these are things like cash and capital, and includes interest and depreciation in there. And so our financial costs allow us to be able to see the ability of a farm to reinvest. So whether you have the ability to reinvest into the enterprise. And the last part here is kind of that economic and long-term costs. And so it's really representing the opportunity costs. And the biggest part that we put into here was the unpaid producer labor. And the reason why we did that is because we know that that family members and producers put in hours into the dairy goat operation, and wanted to evaluate in terms of, are they receiving a market value return on their labor? So that's how it's broken down. You'll see these colors in the next slide as well too, in the kind of ongoing slides with the cost of production, in order in these various categories, so cash, financial, and economic. So I'll just present very quickly the overall doe costs. And so I've I have done the exchange rate on these so that you don't have to sit and wonder how that transfers into US dollars. I just based it on the exchange rate for now. Our exchange rate has been fairly around in the 70 cent area for a while. So that's what I've done in terms of our exchange rate at that time. So this graph here just represents, and these costs here represent the cost of production per doe. And so we have it broken down into the various years, 2019, 2020, and 2021. And the cash costs are this light blue color. Any government rebates or any kind of government grants or anything are in the orange. The capital costs are this darker blue, and the producer labor is the kind of turquoisey green color at the top here. So the cost of production results per doe is based on an average number of milking and dry does in a herd per year, because we do understand that does change and can change throughout the year. And the highest year was 2019 at $1,190 Canadian dollars, or 870 US dollars at that side. The lowest time was 2020. And you can see that reflected there, and then fairly stable for 2021. So it's important to note that this cost of production does reflect just the dairy goat enterprise. It doesn't reflect other enterprises on the operation. So some of the things that we can take away here is that the overall cash costs increased in 2021. The capital costs decreased in 2021 as compared to the previous 2 years, and the producer labor maintained relatively stable on that side. And so this allowed us to be able to kind of look at, well, what's that cost of a doe in your operation? But that doesn't really give us that breakdown of a per liter basis, and being able to account for what that means. And so we looked at it more, and most of the presentation is now going to focus on a standardized liter as opposed to looking at it as an overall doe result. So the reason why we spend more time talking about standardized liter is that producers are paid per liter of milk based on their components. So this kind of brings more true in terms of how that reporting comes back. So again, we kind of see the same trend. So we had some cash costs reduce in it's just this blue bar here. Some cash costs reduce in 2020. This is partially due to that economic slowdown period. If you'll notice from our dates here, we were right in the midst of the pandemic, which had a lot of impact in terms of the economy and thereafter. And so one of the things in here as well is that this reduced cash cost can also be due to these producers selling more animals than were purchased. And so, and that's one of the things that we saw on that side. So the overall and you'll see with the capital cost very similar too. It leans out in 2021 as compared to the previous years. And the economic on a per liter basis is the labor also decreases by 2021. And so this results in a decrease in cost of production for the 2021 results. But what we're hearing, from producers is like, well, I'm paying more for things in my operation. And that rings true. The cash costs had increased in 2021. And this was really seen in the feed prices as well as repair and maintenance. I think many of you probably on the line here can agree that that some of those maintenance costs have increased over the years, and that's where we started to see this in 2021. But this brings, Oh,
Can I ask a question? So on the top right, where it has US dollars per hundredweight, is that another study or is that this study correlated?
Yeah, that's the study. That's the study with that's this particular study. So just the conversion of that. So ours are all in, it's all in liters. So trying to bring it back to what you see, what you're seeing in the States.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah. And so so bringing to the side here, so this would be, so these are just a conversion of these numbers here for 2019, 2020, and 2021, in terms of what that cost is. And the last, oh,
Can I ask how did you handle any inventory changes? Like if they had more does at the end of the year than they did at the beginning, was that accounted for or no?
yeah, it was accounted for. So we did have full inventory listing that they had to do. So we were treating it, we treated it as like a full inventory. So as you have replacements coming in, they are introduced into like the next category, for instance. So a Doling's bred, and then she comes to kid and she's entering into the milking dough. So when we're looking at kind of overall inventory, we took an account for people selling or purchasing animals, and that would fit into that. So we ended up having to do it as an average of the number of milking does, as opposed to any more clarity of that. We didn't we saw some changes in inventory, and that would primarily be from the standpoint of the selling does, especially in 2020 and 2021. We see a selling of does during that time.
And the gain for that is shown where? Is that what category?
It's going to be concluded into the cash cost. So we didn't put it, we didn't put it into any of the other categories, and it's actually on my next slide. So so you'll see, no worries. So you'll see how that fits into the cash costs on that side, especially with the selling animals. So having a lower inventory than you began with at the beginning of the year. Yeah, and so we'll get to that on the next one, but one of the things that I wanted to just point out here is in terms of the large variability in terms of our expenses, so or the cost of production. So the minimum for one of the farms that were a part of the study was 89 cents per liter Canadian, and the maximum was $2.39. So this is one of the things where we knew that there was variability in cost of production on farms. We have a lot of different kind of farm operations. They have different levels of technology, different levels of automation, and everything. But I think we weren't prepared for maybe this high level of variability. And you have to remember that this is 16 farms. So it'd be great to repeat this again with more farms, but just want to put that out there. And so you will notice that here the government rebates. So we do have some government rebates that are below the zero line there. And so this is taking account for anything in terms of being a part of some of the pandemic relief programs that were available during this time. And this income item offsets that cost of production. So so that's why you're seeing this at below that line. So what we do see as well is that the producer labor dropped in this 2021 era as well. And this is due to an increase in producer labor, which you'll see in the coming slides. But based on what we have here, producers were able to have improved labor efficiencies through this period of time based on a standardized leader. So whether that's maybe they're putting the same leaders in, but they're getting more components, or they're getting more liters per doe based on some of their own herd improvements. So if they're selling off some of those less productive animals, they're going to get that bump in terms of increased efficiency. And so the next weight here is our cash costs. So this is the big breakdown. This is the one where producers spend more time kind of thinking about in terms of cash going out the door. And so I guess no surprise here, but the purchase feed and homegrown feeds really represented like 50% to 60% of the cost. So if you remember what I said at the beginning of this part of the presentation, was that the purchase feeds and the homegrown feeds are were kind of that the homegrown feeds were included into the cash cost. We didn't do that as an economic market value. And so they're the largest cash costs. And what we're looking at in terms of homegrown feeds is that crop input, the machinery expenses, but not the interest rate on that. So you'll see another category here as well too. So this goes back to the question that was asked in terms of other direct livestock expenses. And so this is looking at our net livestock purchases. So this is purchase minus sales and that. So being below zero in these categories here, it's showing that farms in 2020 and 2021 were selling off more animals than they were purchasing in. And so at the end of the day, this is one of the reasons that we saw that decrease in cost of production from 2020 to 2021, regardless of the increase cash costs. So in this case here, we're seeing 66 cents in 2020 and then 71 cents in 2021. And you can see that impact of that increase in terms of feed costs on those categories. But we're getting some offsetting from the sale of some of those animals out of that particular system. And so I know one of the things that we're looking at this time was more producers were making more culling decisions in terms of their operation and moving out more less productive animals. And so for our other categories here, vet and breeding is this small bar here. We have building repairs in here as well, and hired labor and kind of the overall of the overhead costs that are in there as well. So one of the other parts of cost of production is that we want to look at making sure that we have our labor efficiencies and liters sold per hour. And so the liters per hour sold per labor hour was 61.3 liters in 2019 and increased to 65.5 liters in 2021. Again, because this is based on standardized liters, that can be from improved efficiencies on the farm. You're getting, you may be getting more production from your does based on improving best management practices, maybe improving, maybe improved in feeding system, or have culled out some of those less productive does. And the overall people equivalent, so this is 3,000 hours per person per year, increased at this time as well too. And so the reason why we wanted to make sure that we're taking in that account that producer labor was partially due to what we're seeing from a labor standpoint from previous work done through the Ag Census. And so producers are the blue bar here. The dairy goat farm operators are this dark blue bar here. Dairy cattle farms are the light blue bar. But farms were reporting that they were working more than 40 hours per week. And for dairy goat operations, if I just flip back quickly to this cash cost graph, not many of them have hired labor. And so most of this is coming from family labor and owner labor. So where are goat producers spending most of their money? Well, feed. So feed's number one cost, makes up 44% of the cost of production on this side. And then followed by labor, so our producer labor and what we'd valued that at. And then we have other expenses in here as well. So if we break down our feed costs a little bit further, we're seeing that dairy ration and protein supplement make up a big portion of that cost and expense, followed by the milk replacer and doling ration that the operations are purchasing on the side as well. And so this purchase feed is mainly coming into the dairy ration, which makes sense with how we typically are feeding goats in Ontario. So kind of one last piece to focus in on our feed part, and how, I guess first how this compares with our milk price. So the average milk price was around $1 per liter. And these are the same bars as previously. So around $1.20 for cost per liter. So you'll see that in these graphs, the milk price is taking care of the cash costs as well as the capital costs, but only a portion of the producer labor. And that's the same for each 3 of these years. And I guess for perspective, out of the farms that have participated across all of these years, only 18% of the time were the cash costs, capital costs, and producer labor covered. And so this is not, we don't see this as unique to dairy goats. We see this in a number of other commodities as well. And really this portion here of the producer labor is really depending on how producers are compensating themselves in terms, and individuals of their family within the operation. So we did go through and had valued farm labor at $25 per Canadian per hour. And if it's a management type of position, it would be valued at $45 per hour, which, to be honest, is not too far off of what we're seeing for fair market value for hiring labor right now within the province. So depending on that compensation, it's obviously going to change for an individual farm in terms of what that producer labor compensation looks like in this area looks like. So our last part here is just to look at the return over feed and the feed costs. So return over feed is that farm revenue minus the feed costs. So that's going to allow us to be able to see how much is left over for other expenses on the farm. We then have feed costs as percentage of farm revenue. And then our last part is the operating expense. So this is cash and interest costs divided by our farm revenue. We'll go through each one of those. So it's important to look at this part here in order to have an understanding in terms of, with feed being the highest cost on our farm, how much is going to be left over for us to be able, left over for a producer to be able to fill some of those other expenses. And so our leftover piece of, after we've taken into account farm revenue minus feed costs, is 48 cents per liter in 2019, 47 cents in 2020, and 42 cents in 2021. And so you see this reflection of increased feed costs in this particular graph here, where we're seeing less of 6 cents per liter, standardized liter, for that cost. And this really comes into an impact of that a lot of our farms are feeding through a complete feed or component feed system. So they're highly reliant on purchased feeds. We do have some, this graph here is just showing a survey results from 2016, where we do have some producers that have total mixed ration or partial mixed ration systems. But most of them that have responded to this study were component or complete feed. And of all those farms, 84% of the farms are feeding in pellet in the parlor as well. So, when purchase feeds go up, then that's going to impact the be able to impact in terms of the money that's left over for other expenses. So feed costs are representing close to 60% of our farm revenue, and the operating expense ratio, which is operating expenses divided by farm revenue, is around 70%. So you do see some of the decrease in some of that, and so that's really reflecting some of that, some of the grants that we had available through that period of time to help people with extra costs. And due to the pandemic, and then also that change in inventory within these farms as well. So just my last slide here, and we can take some questions, but one of the key things that we wanted to be a part of this project was the development of a cost of production tool. So for producers, so we have an Excel-based tool that is customizable for different feed systems, for the size of operations, and also includes the benchmarking data. And so there'll be a link that will be shared after today's presentation. It takes you to the sheep and goat production blog, which is a blog that is ran by my colleagues and myself. And the link will take you directly to this cost of production tool. And my summer student from this year had done some how-to videos on how to work with this tool. So I won't have time. We had done some work previously on going through the tool with producers in an online meeting. I don't have time to go through it today, but I encourage you to take a download of that and see if it's something that you can use within your operation.
All right. Well, thanks for your presentation today here, Marlene. I think it was really great information, and I appreciate you doing the conversions on the slides as well. So that helped everyone as they're processing the information to go through that. So I appreciate that. We are getting a little past 1 o'clock here, Marlene. So again, we appreciate you being on the webinar here today, and we'll do some follow-up with the resources that you provided with your handout of the cost of production, as well as that link for the economic tool that people can look at as well. So again, I appreciate everybody being on, and hopefully you can join us in December. December 21st, we'll be back talking about milk quality as we wrap up our 2023 webinar series.